Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Living Streams
Marriage
Church.
podcast.
Yep. Oh, the marriage. Oh, the deep dive.
The
marriage.
marriage.
Marriage. It's what brings us together today. You weren't allowed to not use that clip on Sunday, or that.
If
I
we
guess you
didn't,
used it in meme format, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what's funny is when you were David, for those of you who haven't caught Sunday's sermon yet, he referenced what's the
Princess Bride, the movie.
Yep. A couple of times in there, and it made me and my wife think, oh, we should watch that. It's been a little while since I've seen that movie. It's a good one. But
it's a cult film, yeah.
We are week 2 of our marriage series.
Yes.
Heard a little bit of testimony and story from the Watkins, which was really cool.
That was
special
fun.
Component. I think it's been really cool hearing from little snippets of people's marriages in our congregation as we've been setting that up. I should, by the way, introduce myself, Alec Seekins, David Stockton, and as always off camera, Dalton Davis, although occasionally he's on camera.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the time he's hiding behind the camera.
He's the mysterious voice that lurks.
So, David, this week you brought us through 1 Corinthians 7.
Yeah, I did.
But before we dive into that, how's your week going? What's going on?
It's going good. My daughter's got me dropping her off, picking her up multiple times at school today because end of the year stuff or whatever. So little hiccups there.
Have you done the Waymo thing?
No. Her friend and her have taken a Waymo before, but I haven't done it. I actually was trying to take a Waymo one time, but I guess they don't go to that part of town. Oh. I was going to a shadier part of town, and I could get it to pick me up, but then it was like, out of range.
I'm not going to take you there.
So I was like, oh, okay.
That's funny. Yeah, it occurred to me the other day. I was like, by the time my kid is in junior high, I'll probably feel very normal about putting him in a Waymo and sending him someplace.
Yeah. Maybe it won't be Waymo, though.
Yeah. Something else. Yeah, Tesla.
Way less or something.
Yeah. way less. Yeah. Who knows,
joke.
Man? But yeah, so you're playing Mr. Dad Waymo today?
Yeah. That's just been a little wrinkle in my day. I had a pretty full day, so then it's like, whoa, how do I squeeze this in?
Gotta get it
but
in there.
It's okay. Kids are more important than jobs.
Jobs and podcasts and meetings and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but things are good. I mean, it's getting a little warm out there. But my whole family is just buzzing with end of school. Yeah. Yeah, because my wife's teaching too. So everyone's just like, I asked Brittany the other day, I said, who's more excited about school getting out, the teachers or the kids? She said, teachers 100%.
Yeah.
Which is funny. I never really thought about that as a kid. Funny. You never really thought about teachers.
How are your air conditionings holding up?
Oh, they're good.
They're doing good?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. We'll see. The test is coming.
We've got a minivan, and the AC is just fine on it, but there's a lot of room in that minivan.
Oh yeah, it takes a while to cool down.
Yeah, for that thing to cool down.
Yeah, well, I just got mine fixed actually a couple months ago, and it's just been awesome.
Yeah.
That's
awesome. Good stuff. That's such a Phoenix question. How's your AC doing?
Yeah,
it's good for now. Let's see what happens in July.
For sure.
Very few ACs survive July for too many years in a row.
But the marriage series also, that's been a big deal. I feel like I always get a little intimidated when we're talking about marriage for some reason, but it's been really great study for me, and it's been fun. The testimonies have been huge. Having people share their marriage stories and testimonies there added a lot of color. And 1 Corinthians 7. Yeah, you have to. It's so practical, so systematic about marriage. Even though it's not like warm and fuzzy. There's no romance in there really, but it's just fun to see Paul be so clear.
And you gave us, that's true. There are a couple. We were just talking a second ago. Like there's a couple of his bullet points on his outline where you're like, there's not much for us to say on that. Like when he's talking about divorce and remarriage, it's pretty clear.
Well, I read the whole chapter, all 40 verses, because I kept trying to figure out how to cut it up. Like, okay, well, we could talk about this on the podcast, but that just felt like there was no right breaks in that. So I was like, let's just read the whole thing, let it wash over everybody, because it's hitting. He actually says there. He says to the unmarried, I say this. To the married, I say this. And then he says, and to the rest. And immediately you're like, what? What's the rest? But that's how complex life is because of our, human nature, because of sin, because of us not getting everything right. It's not that simple. It's not married and unmarried.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other complications. There's those who are post-marriage.
Yeah.
There are those who are betrothed, which he says in there, which back then had a little bit more, like engagement was a little bit bigger deal than what it is today.
Yeah.
Someone could be engaged since they were babies or whatever. But
and more of a familial thing, like and I didn't have time to do a deep enough dive to fully wrap my head around the ancient kind of Greco-Roman first century betrothal culture there, but it certainly wasn't like ours.
Certainly they weren't letting teenagers decide who they wanted to marry.
Yeah, they were telling teenagers who they decided.
That's what I'm saying. They weren't letting teenagers do that, which is, I don't know if it's such a good idea for us to be doing that either.
But I did see that I think the legal age in Rome at the time for girls, I think, was 12 or 13. For boys was 14. But betrothal could come before that. Yeah. So obviously, and it was definitely what you see for most of human history and in the movies. It's a family tied together thing. So there's a political and a kind of sub-political or micro-political dynamics going on
jockeying,
there. Yeah. So you might very well be betrothed to someone that is not.
Exciting
the girl that you met a little while ago. Exactly.
Yeah. But so he's talking about, people who are divorced. He talks about people to the rest. He's saying some of you are married, but your spouse is a non-believer.
Yeah.
So what are you supposed to do about those type of things? And so that's why we just read all of it, but we got to start with the first verse.
Yeah.
I mean, the first verse is enough to just kind of shock you out of whatever stupor you were in. He says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. So obviously they're asking Paul questions.
Dialogue,
and he says, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman.
Yeah.
Just like, boom.
Yeah.
That is the first sentence. And I joked in this message where I was like, and luckily he didn't stop there. you know? But that by itself is just a wild statement, for Paul to make. And then what we know about Paul is, that was Paul.
Yeah.
He never had sexual relations with women, as far as what we know in history. Now there is debate about whether he was married at some point, and some people think he is. But then all of a sudden, there's like no mention of kids, anywhere in there. So I'm like, well, if he was married as a Pharisee, then most likely he would have kids. But I guess that's not a for sure thing too. So I don't know. I actually in my study came to the conclusion just going, I'm just going to take Paul as single. I don't have to make him married for this stuff to have more meaning or anything.
Yeah, or having had been married.
Or having had been married,
Because I think the other argument is, he widowed or divorced.
Yeah.
Would be which I've always kind of heard is the more likely option.
Well, if there's an option at all, but,
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah, because the argument I've heard before, and I don't know, I haven't personally dug into this, is like, had he been a Pharisee, that would have meant that he...
Yeah, but when I looked into that, there's no...
It's not true.
No automatics in that regard.
That's why we study, because you often hear things, and unfortunately, it's getting a lot better, I think, with the internet and giving more access for people to do their own study. Yeah. But oftentimes, things kind of float around that aren't necessarily accurate.
Yeah. And we know Paul was hardcore.
Yeah.
Whatever he did it hardcore, for sure.
I think one thing, taking a half a step back on that verse, it says concerning the matters about which you wrote. That right there unveils something that is a key to understanding a lot of the New Testament, and I think it is especially helpful in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, which is, as we read this letter, we're reading part A of a dialogue. Yeah. And there is a part B to the dialogue, and we don't have that recorded. Right. And I often tell people it's like...
Well, we're reading part B.
Yeah, that's true.
We're missing part A,
part B. Like if you ever, like if you're texting with your wife or a friend or whatever or something, and they send you a big long text message with a bunch of items. You generally will reply to them with a big, long... hopefully you just say, can we just talk on the phone or go get coffee or whatever? But you may reply with a very lengthy blue bubble, right? if you're an iPhone user, I guess.
Yeah.
And in that reply, you're going to roughly hit the things that they were mentioning in order, but you're not necessarily even cueing them. Oh, you said this and let me reply this, and you said that and let me reply this. You're not necessarily doing bullet points in the same order. It's the same order, but you're just replying naturally. That happens in the New Testament. That happens certainly in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And here's one example where Paul is making it pretty clear, like, hey, you asked about these things, let me tell you about this stuff. But there's other places in the letter where he's like nodding to what they've said, and that can get confusing a little bit because we're only reading part B of it. So it's really helpful to read epistles of the Bible, the letters that we find in the New Testament, with the awareness that, like, oh, like, can I connect the dots? Like, what's the part of the conversation I'm missing here? That can help clarify things. Sometimes when the author says something the opposite of what they're about to say, and it's because they're saying, hey, like, you said this, I'm saying this. Or somebody else said this.
It's like a Q&A session without the Q.
Exactly. And so that's part of what's happening here. So that's really fruitful to know. I did a little bit of, not that it's a profound revelation, but digging in a bit to the Greek there. And things get a little, obviously topics here, little spicy there, but
spicy.
Generally speaking. But
it's not spicy for the internet.
But what he's saying, that's true. The internet can get a lot worse than well, I don't know. 1st and 2nd Corinthians can get pretty gnarly, but he's saying it's good for a man not to touch a woman, which the connotations are obvious. There's nothing to do. But what's interesting is actually that word haptos, from which I'm assuming we get the word haptic feedback, or whatever. Also, one of the usages of that would be like to set fire to something, which it definitely means to touch something. Like, that's what it means. But it would be almost, maybe you might say, a euphemism for setting fire to something. So I think there's maybe even a little bit of like kind of double, triple, quadruple wordplay there, where he's obviously just very clearly saying what we have it translated. I'm not sure what translation you're reading, what it says, for him, a man to have sexual relationship with a woman.
Yes.
Super crystal clearly he's saying that, but there's a little bit of this, he's nodding to what he says later about, like, oh, it's better to marry than to burn. There's some kind of wordplay going on there. But there's almost this, potential, I suppose, and I'd have to dig deeper to say if this is accurate or not, but linguistic connotation of like arousing someone, like kind of getting something going a little bit, and I think you can track with that a little bit in what he's saying, and that actually also fits with elsewhere in the Bible where it says is it Song of Solomon or Proverbs where it says don't awaken desire, or what does it say? Don't awaken love until it so desires, or
until it's time.
Until it's time, yeah. But there's a little bit of that going on here too, to a certain extent. So just some more colors. To add into the conversation. That's happening here.
The Pope, the new Pope. Hopefully, that's where it's coming from. He's like, I just always think about these guys, the priests. It's just such an amazing thing that they've devoted their sexuality to the Lord in that regard, and nuns as well. It's. I know I'm really thankful that in our tradition, that's not the way things go, because being married to Brittany and all that has been this wonderful thing that I think the Lord has had for me. But you got to respect that as well. Just people who are, completely given to the Lord in that way. And this verse would be encouraging to them because they're saying, hey, it's good. It's a good thing. And our culture would say, oh, that's such a bad thing. Again, I think our culture just thinks if you're not having sex, you can't actually be happy. And that's just so stupid. And I feel like so many of the arguments, even within different realities of sexuality, homosexuality, whatever, trans, like there's this premise that, well, if you're not having sex, you're not really living. And so then to abstain from sex, if you have homosexual desires, would be just, oh, so you don't want me to live? And it's like, well, no, you're starting with a bad premise. You can be totally fulfilled in life. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations. Like, not having sex is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not something's wrong. It's not a less thing in any way, shape, or form. It's a good thing. And And yet what I think is so cool about Paul in this whole chapter is he's upholding something as saying, this is really good, this is really special, but here's some concessions.
Yeah.
Here's some other ways depending on where you're at in regards to this thing. And that's exactly what he does. It's good for you, man, not to touch a woman or not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because there's so much temptation to sexual immorality in the world, then each man should have his own wife, and each each woman should have her own husband.
Yeah.
And so again, for Paul, he was saying it's kind of a weird way to enter into how marriage is a good thing.
Yeah.
Because like we just looked at it last week, where marriage is this beautiful thing that God created that produces so much beauty in the world, so much good in the world. And now he's saying, well, it's good for you to get married if you just can't control it. Like if you want to give in, if you want to avoid temptation, sexually and all these, it's good for you to get married and devote yourself to a woman or to a spouse in that way. It's good if you can devote your sexuality to the Lord, but because there's so much challenge there, it's also good for you to do this.
Yeah.
Which is such a funny way to say it, I feel like.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you did a quick nod on this, right? But probably could have done obviously a whole sermon right here. But it's interesting, and let me just look up really quickly, make sure I'm not misquoting the passage. So it's in verse 3, it says, and the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. This is the ESV, and likewise the wife to her husband. I think the first thing to note, which is what just the context you gave when you were reading it on Sunday, was, hey, the parts that we chafe against were the parts that were like easy and given to the Corinthians, and the parts that like we don't even notice are the parts that they were having real issue with. So in the ancient Greco-Roman world, which is Corinth, a city known as basically the Las Vegas or the Ibiza of
what happened in Corinth stayed in Corinth.
Yeah, exactly. Of the ancient Greco-Roman world. But in the Greco-Roman world, the assumption was that like all of the boundaries on sexuality were for women and not for men. So it was not unusual in a wealthy house for there to be a room specifically devoted for the head of the household, for the man, for the husband, to having sexual relationships with people that were not his wife. And so adultery wasn't even considered necessarily a thing that a man could do. There were ways that were not acceptable that honestly aren't worth discussing, but it had to do with the sort of intercourse that was being engaged in that was not acceptable for a man. But it had nothing to do with infidelity, as we would look at it, as the Bible would look at it. But for a woman, of course, to be sleeping with someone that wasn't her husband was unacceptable. And so Paul is consistent. The New Testament is consistent in shifting that, changing that dynamic, and actually saying, no, marriage is supposed to be mutually loving, mutually submitted. Like that is the call here. And so it's interesting that Paul starts off by saying, well, I mean, there's a mirroring, there's a symmetry in what he says, right? Verse 2, because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, each woman her own husband. And then he reverses it, mirrors it, and says, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. In the Greek, it's pay to her what's owed, which is interesting. All of that is language that we're super uncomfortable with. But again, we need to remember, hey, these are actually euphemisms. So it's a euphemism we don't like, but actually it is Paul being soft in the way he's having this conversation. And the ESV just tries to make it a little bit more clear by avoiding the euphemism altogether. And likewise, the wife to her husband. But basically what Paul is saying, hey, husbands, you owe your wife something, sexually speaking. It is not just a you show up and get what you desire. This is not a filling your sexual appetite sort of relationship, which is still the temptation in many, many relationships here today. I think both parties often come saying, hey, what can I get? I love what Jim Watkins said about the 80-80 relationship. I thought that was so good of like, no, I'm trying to put in 80% of this. Yeah. I'm here to serve and not to be served. Give more than you get, yeah. And that is a really common issue. I mean, there is so much discord, there's so much discord in many people's sexual interactions with their spouse. And oftentimes it has to do with, hey, this person is coming to get what they want and then moving about their way and doesn't really care for what I'm getting. Or this person is so tired of that dynamic or has boundaries or barriers or whatever that they're just avoiding the intimacy altogether. And it really is important for both husband and wife, both partners, to come from a perspective of how can I serve here? How can I lay myself down here? So Paul is talking about this, not saying, hey, make sure you're having all the sex that you guys want. Paul is saying, hey, make sure you're giving your spouse what is important to be giving them.
Yeah.
What is
followed
rightly
up with for the wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And that was the joke too. It was like, luckily he didn't stop there, because then it says, which would have been a shock to that culture, that the woman has authority over the man's body.
Yes, because legally, in the Greco-Roman world, that was true, that the husband had authority over the wife's body, and she was property.
Yeah. But here, you know, which is amazing, is that this New Testament written is completely undoing a lot of that, which is cool. But I think like you were saying, even like all of marriage is about giving. Right? Marriage, you know, a husband is supposed to give to his wife as Christ gave to the church, which is giving unconditionally everything, you know, and then same way wives, you know, give to their husbands in that way. It's all about giving. And I just think that's cool in a lot of different ways, time, energy, space, you know, all these things. But it even comes down to, you know, sex, which I've just always thought was so fascinating and kind of like this beautiful, like nuanced reality where sex in our culture, again, is all about self-gratification.
Yeah.
It's all about, you know, getting yourself to feel this thing. But Paul's not shying away from sex in marriage. He's talking about sex in marriage, and he's saying even there, it should always be to get to bless the other person, to gratify the other person. That's what it's about. That's what it's about. I just think it's such a beautiful, beautiful thing to picture in that way, with marriage just being giving yourself away, and that's what he says. And even he says, you know, and if there comes a point in your marriage where it's really difficult to give yourself because something's been done, there's some damage, there's some pain, there's something, whatever it might be, he says it's okay to separate for a season. You know, this is not divorce. This is just separate, which basically means abstain from sexual activity, maybe even abstaining from conversation. So you devote yourself to prayer. But then he says afterwards, you need to come have sex again, is basically what he's saying. He said after that time, you can't settle into some sort of separation. No, marriage is about union. So you need to come all the way back together. So even
that's interesting. I've never read it. So you're reading it as you think he's discussing something like what we would call separation?
Absolutely.
Oh, interesting.
Right there where he says in verse 5, do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, then come together again.
Yeah, I guess I've always considered that something like fasting from sex.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, but I think it also can, I mean, it can also be, hey, this is a time where we might need to separate a little bit more. And I actually love that as a concession, right? Like that's not the ideal, it's not the goal. Yeah. But in this, Paul's constantly making options for people to take that don't violate a commandment, but they also ease some of the intensity. Because I think that's what happens is when you're so close with someone for so long and something goes wrong, I mean, you have to be able to breathe. Yeah. And so, but I love that he attaches that to that, say, but just so you know, if you're going to separate, if you're going to have a season where you devote yourself to prayer, then it has to end with full coming together, not a partial coming together, not living in the same house, you know, kind of going through the motions together. But he's saying you need to get back to that intimacy and give yourselves to each other again. And so I think it's so brilliant. Yeah. Like it really is. Psychologically, sociologically, but also it's so pastoral and kind and compassionate, knowing that sex is something that sometimes when there's hurt in a relationship, it's the hardest thing to do. Yeah. And yet he's making he's creating a path and a plan to deal with even that challenge. It's just awesome.
Yeah.
This whole chapter is so amazing.
Yeah. Before we even move another word further, there's two things I wanted to say. One is, I know we can chafe at, who's got authority over whose body. That obviously sounds really uncomfortable for us. But here's the missing piece of the puzzle. What is biblical authority? Jesus says, all authority has been given to me. And how did Jesus exercise his authority? Exercise it. Even in the beginning of Genesis, we're told that the sun and the moon and the stars, that they are meant to rule over. Well, how do they rule over? They illuminate, they give light. They display God's glory. How does the husband exercise his authority over his wife's body, and the wife exercise her authority over her husband's body? Well, by illuminating, by leading, by serving, by laying down their life the way Jesus did. Yeah. Jesus made it really clear. We don't do authority the way the world does. Yeah. We do it by serving, which we already talked about that pretty exhaustively, but I think that's so important.
There's a picture on that didn't make it in the sermon on Sunday, but I thought about it. And I can't remember where it came from, but it's this picture of heaven and hell. Mm-hmm. And in both heaven and hell, you've got this round table just full of all this food. Mm-hmm. And everyone's sitting around this round table. But the catch is that no one has elbows. Yeah. Right? And so everyone's got elbows. And so there's all this food, all these spoons, all this stuff to eat. But in heaven, you have everyone feeding the person next to them, right? Because the elbow can only reach that way. Yeah. Whereas hell, no one's eating, even though it's all there, because everyone's so self-centered, they won't serve someone else. So it's funny. I picture that. I love that picture of what heaven is like. It's where everyone's serving each other, so everyone has. Yeah. No one is without. Yeah. But that's a bit of what I think he's trying to get to here.
And that's why Nancy Pearcey talks about in her book, Toxic War and Masculinity. Actually, the issue here in these verses is that when you have men who are just kind of barely popping into church, these verses become weapons. And so they actually, if we just look at domestic abuse within the church, that subset of men who are kind of floating around the periphery of church are actually more abusive than the average American guy.
The wishy-washy.
Yeah. But that's what offset by the men who are actually real disciples, who are pretty consistently coming to church and connecting and plugging in and studying the Word of God, who are significantly less so. And so the result is, when you look at, Christian men who go to church sometimes, or in general, men who would say that they go to church sometimes, it's the same levels of domestic abuse as it is in the world. But it's because these verses, a shallow understanding of the Word of God, is actually pretty dangerous. That's perhaps why Jesus says, hey, I'd rather you were hot or cold, get in or get out. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to say is in verse 5, we started talking about, it says, do not deprive one another. That word deprive, another connotation of it, another definition of it would be to defraud. And you might even see it translated that way in a few verses, but obviously deprivation is a little more obvious. But and if you look at the biblical usage of it, this word is actually most often being used in more of a defrauding context, And so it's interesting that he's saying, hey, don't defraud one another. So obviously in this verse, that we understand why we said deprive, because he then moves on to say, except perhaps by agreement, you don't agree to defraud each other. So there's all this going on here, and that's the way words are. They carry a lot of meaning at the same time. So you can understand why they've chosen deprive, but what he's getting at, I think why that's important for us to understand that, is because there is a thing that you can do in your marriage that is defrauding the other of sexual intimacy. That's actually using sexual intimacy as a way to unfairly get gain from your partner. And so that could be, when we talk about withholding sex, that term in and of itself, I think, is, for the most part, the connotation of it in our language is we're not gonna have sex because I want you to this, I want you to that, I want to do this, and I think again we're back at that mutual serving thing, right? Like, sex is not a way to get something from your partner, to get something from your spouse. Sex is a way to give something to your spouse, and so I think that the next question for a lot of couples might be, okay, well then what is this? What implications does this have on maybe the frequency of sexual intimacy in our marriage, and
I think that's what's so funny in some ways about this is like before you're married,
Yeah.
It's like you you need to be constantly told through the scriptures, like, hey, don't have sex. Like, don't have sex before you get married. Don't go across that chasm, until there's a covenant established, and until you're ready to fulfill a lifelong covenant. And so there's this there's constant don't have sex. And then it's funny now Paul's talking to married people and he's like, hey, you need to have sex.
Yeah.
And I think it just goes to show the power of sex. I think it shows how high a view the Bible has of sex, that it's this special thing, almost like a sacrament type thing. Like there's something holy about it. There's something that is unifying about it, as two souls become one in that regard. And so it's just so funny that then it would make sense that in marriage, the things that's challenged would be that intimacy. And sex is kind of this fragile flower that if everything's going right, then it blooms, and then it buds, and it's this beautiful thing. But if anything's wrong, that's going to be a challenge, or that's going to be a difficulty, that kind of intimacy. Or if things aren't right and you're forcing that, it creates a whole different kind of distrust and kind of a gross feeling and all these things. So, but it's just interesting that, for couples, a lot of times Paul's saying, hey, you need to give yourselves to each other. And if you're not giving yourselves to each other, then maybe there's a problem, and there should be some separation, some attention to what's going on, so that you can come back together in that, because it's a natural byproduct of intimacy, that romance and all of those things. So I know that might be really heavy for some people. Listen, if you're like, look, romance has been very difficult in my marriage, or recently in my marriage, and again, I think Paul's not trying to say, oh, you're a bad person or you should be ashamed of yourself, but he is saying that, hey, maybe there is something you can do to kind of agree for a separation at time, because maybe for the woman, they're still having sex, but it's actually become something that's hurtful now. Or for the man, that could happen as well. And it's like, hey, can we separate and try and get some things right with our trust, with our heart, with the Lord, with each other, and then almost have a season. And it's cool what the Gerard said in their testimony. They actually were married, not knowing the Lord, divorced, not knowing the Lord. Then they met each other. They both met the Lord while they were single post-marriage. And then somehow in the process, the Lord renewed their hearts, did something new, and then they decided they wanted to get married again, but they set a time period of abstaining, saying, we're not going to cross this bridge as far as sexuality until we get married again. And it was almost like there was a renewal that happened in that. So when they did get married and they came together, it was a completely different thing. And so I just think that it's just something so beautiful about that. And I think, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay to say, hey, this is hurting, or this is not helping, and can we try and adjust something? Because I want to get back to this place. Now, that's what, again, the goal of the separation is not just, oh, I need a break. The goal is so that I can get to a place where that feels like a flower again in my life. That feels like a joy in my life. And so we can't use the scriptures and try and, again, manipulate them to where it's saying, oh, I just need a break from you, or I don't like you. That's not the goal of the separation.
What do you say to the partner who's feeling deprived, and what do you say to the partner who's feeling like there's too much intimacy, or who's feeling like, no, I need to, that's difficult?
Yeah, I don't think you can just talk to one. You have to talk to both, and if both are saying the same thing, oh yeah, that's pretty easy. When both are saying opposite things, that's where I think there needs to be probably some sort of agreement and separation where both can seek the Lord and get on the same page again, and then move forward. And so you just set a 30 days, or I think anything beyond 30 days starts to become, there's some real challenges. And because that's the one thing. I actually remember counseling someone, and someone else was telling them they were really nervous about any separation because it could lead to just kind of, separation that leads to divorce. Mm-hmm. And instead of separation that leads to healthy reunion. Mm-hmm. And I get that. So there's, I think, a delicacy to the time frame. And that's what he's saying. But he says, come together so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Because if there's too much separation for too long, then there's a whole other set of temptations that come that complicate things. So, yeah, I mean, it could be 2 weeks. It could be 30 days. It all depends on the couple. But and I would, if I was counseling a couple, I would find out what the situation is and then do that. But again, I just love that there's this caveat that Paul offers here in this specific situation.
Yeah. What I think it's worth saying too, the word deprive or defraud is a strong word. And I think for some people in some marriages that can feel like, I think you were saying this too, right? Like the two different partners can have a very different sense of what feels like deprivation or defrauding, right? It's not uncommon at all for within the context of any marriage for libido to be mismatched. Mm-hmm. I'd say probably most marriages have one person who has a little higher libido, one person who has a little bit less. So if you're the person who has a little bit higher, it would be very easy in your flesh and the selfishness to feel deprived if you're saying, hey, I'd like more frequency here than my spouse, than what feels right and normal to them. And I think I think it's first worth noting that Paul's using a strong word here. Someone who has 3 meals a day and a few snacks, don't get too literal with that analogy there, isn't being deprived if they miss a snack every once in a while. Yeah. And so I think it's worth noting that. But I would say, again, we're back to that serving the other, loving the other, giving away instead of taking. And so if you're the partner who has a higher sex drive, it's worth saying, hey, maybe I need to slow down for my partner. And I think that's where some of that wisdom of, hey, before you're married comes in, of saying, actually, I'm going to learn to abstain for however many years or decades of my life, so that potentially if I'm that person in the relationship, this is something that I'm actually really equipped to do. Yeah. And if you're the partner who is on the other side of the coin, I think it's worth saying, okay, well, maybe it would be a good goal to shift your nose to a not yet, but at this time. Yeah. And to say, hey, if there's been if I've rejected in advance, maybe I'll try to make sure that I initiate before my partner feels the need to initiate in the future.
I think I think you're speaking in hypotheticals, trying to be helpful in all those things. But that's where I just think if any of this is saying like, hey, you know what, maybe we do need a little help. I know it sounds weird and crazy, but I think definitely bring it up to your spouse and see if there can be some discussion on that. That can be very difficult. Yeah. And it might sound crazy, but I think finding someone that, like a pastor that maybe you could say, hey, we're having a little, and you could do it separately. Like, the guy could talk to a guy pastor, a girl could talk to a girl pastor or something, to just say, hey, we're just looking for a little pastoral counsel here. And I know that sounds weird and crazy or all those things, but it can really be helpful. Yeah. And it takes a lot of maturity, but it can really be helpful. And it's supposed to be this wonderful, life-giving thing. But there's all kinds of nuance and complications. But the scriptures, I love. The scriptures don't shy away from it. The scriptures know. God knows. And He wants to help us figure out how to bloom in every aspect of our life, even in that regard. But let's move on. Let's move on.
Move on to the next because there's a whole other large chunk of this passage, of this chapter that
there's lots more debates to be had.
Yeah, some of it is wonderfully clear, like we already talked about, the discussion on divorce. Yeah, I feel like is interestingly clear because you might think the discussion on divorce in the Bible would be unclear.
Yeah, what's hard about the divorce is the amount of pain that people are in, and then they come to these scriptures that are pretty clear on boundaries, and it's even what Jesus said about you could divorce in the case of adultery. When they said it, He's like, but even that was a concession that Moses gave because of the hardness of your hearts. Yeah. So it's like Jesus is giving an out, but also saying, but it's not really an out. So there's so much, but when those scriptures come into play, the amount of pain that people are in, it's, oh man, it's so hard, I think, for people in that much pain to just be able to say okay to the scriptures. I mean, it really feels like crucifixion in a lot of ways. And it's powerful when someone does submit to those, say, okay, Jesus, I know you know best, but my heart is screaming something else. But those boundaries are there, not just for you, they're for your family, your kids, your community. And I had the real, I guess, blessing of kind of 2020, end of 2020, beginning of 2021. I just had so many guys come up to me and tell me about how their wife was leaving them, or they're getting a divorce, or, there was some infidelity or something. And it was interesting because I just had enough guys mention that to me that I thought I should start a group for divorced dads, because so many guys were coming around, and they don't need me. They need each other more than anything, because they're walking through something that's just so intense. And they were all dads too. So I was like, hey, you guys want to start a dads group? I kind of tricked them into coming to this dads group. And then they eventually realized they were all divorced dads. Yeah. But just sitting there and listening to them talk about what they were going through, express what they were feeling and what they were challenged with, and then for the other guys, so I'll do that, and the camaraderie that was built, the encouragement that was built, I loved it. One of the guys who kind of was leading, with me a lot of ways, was setting some ground, was like, well, we will never speak ill of our exes no matter what when we tell these stories. And so there's some real good boundaries that he set, and it just became this amazingly edifying group. Like the depth of edification for me, and I'm not a divorced dad or anything, but just watching the beauty of these guys in their pain cling to Jesus, wrestle with Jesus. It was really something so beautiful to behold. And it just gave me a little bit of a glimpse as to the real agony of divorce. Yeah. And yet the guidance and counsel of the scriptures and of the Holy Spirit that can help people navigate divorce. And it's funny, we've had reunions a bit. Like I'll just say, hey, why don't we all get together again? And one of the guys just cooks these delicious steaks, and he always does that for us. So we'll get together, and then to hear how their hearts, they're in such a more hopeful place. They're in such a okay place. Some of them are, starting to date again, or some of those things. But it's just been so awesome to watch the Spirit and the Scriptures guide them through this and get them to a place where they didn't know if they'd ever be able to get back to, but they're whole again. Yeah. And they have hope again. And they have all the wounds and the scars and all those things still. But it was just this beautiful thing to watch. So what is said here about how to navigate divorce? Again, I love it that he's not shying away. He's not saying, "Oh, this is what you should do," and nothing else. But he's like, "Hey, if you have a non-believing spouse and they want to leave, hey, it's okay. Yeah. God has called you to peace. But if the non-believing spouse wants to stay, it's going to be hard, but I think you should hang in there, because who knows what'll happen. And somehow your kids are better off for that." And he says all of this. I mean, it's the amount of pastoral counsel through here is so beautiful.
One of the really beautiful things I got when my dad passed away was messages from all these marriages that he had saved, And I know that there'd be tons like this, but one particular friend of mine who had watched who was close with one of my siblings and had watched them go the opposite direction, was years ago in a marriage where her husband was not following Jesus and was not a particularly nice guy, but not necessarily abusive or anything, but it was right on the verge of divorce and felt like might have been a good idea, and she started counseling with my dad, and then eventually her husband was counseling with my dad, and long story short, her husband came to the Lord, and her life and marriage and ministry and kids are robust and strong and healthy, because she did exactly what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 7. It was like, okay, he's not wanting to leave yet, so you hold. If he wants to leave, you can open your hands and let him free. But if he's not saying, let's let's leave. If he's still got something in him, then you stay there, you pray, you connect. And it was cool. Really fruitful and beautiful. And she was so grateful for what her family has become in the years since.
That's amazing. It's awesome. Your dad was huge in that way. He was such a wise, principled counselor for so many people for so long. And I've mentioned Kurt. Like Kurt, the joke is on the back of his pastor card. It's like 50 saves. He's been able to just enter. And what I love about Kurt is just the grace he has. So it doesn't matter what kind of mess you found yourself in or how bad the marriage is. Kurt's like, yeah, we got this. Yeah, he just has enough grace for your whole marriage to be able to be to have hope. And Kurt just believes that it doesn't matter how wounded or broken something is. I mean, God is able. He's able to turn it around. No matter how cold or hard the heart has become, the grace of God is more. Yeah. It's always more.
One of the things Kurt will tell you about just his theory of counseling, it's not dissimilar from something my dad would say a little bit differently, but the same thing is, Kurt's like, I only want to counsel a couple for, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sessions tops. If I'm going past that, I'm not doing my job, because my entire goal in this process is to connect them with Jesus to find that help. My dad would say, hey, when someone's coming and they're needing counsel in some regard, give them the fish so that they're not starving today. Give them the practical counsel for the situation that they're facing. And then use that fish as an example, a life lesson, a teachable moment to show them how they can go fishing. And by going fishing, what I mean is teach them to humble themselves before the Lord and each other. Teach them to go to the Holy Spirit and say, Holy Spirit, how do I love my wife? Or I'm feeling deprived, or I'm feeling like there's too much intimacy, or Holy Spirit, how do I go through this divorce? How do I honor my wife who's dragging me and my kids through the mud? How do I remain single? Because I really don't love this season of singleness. How do I find or how do I be content with the fact that I am content with this, but the world around me and maybe even some elements of my church as well are making me feel less than, or not fully human, or not fully a Christian because I'm not married. How do I do that? And the end of all counsel is go to the Lord. Go hear the Lord and obey.
Well, in 1 Corinthians 7, there's so much good news for the single
person.
My gosh. I mean, you can't read this and not wonder in some ways, single's way better. Being single is way better. Even this, he's like, if you're having trouble controlling yourself, then you should get married. It's almost like what he says at the beginning. It's not what he's saying, but it sort of feels like that. He says, if your husband dies and you're a widow, he's like, yeah, you can marry whoever you want, but in my opinion, you'll be a lot happier if you don't. Just time and time he's in. But the overarching thing that he says in here is, it's a gift. If you're single, God has given you a wonderful gift where you have less worldly anxieties and you can be more devoted to the Lord and all of those things. So it's this beautiful, beautiful gift. And our culture just tries to make everybody think it's a curse. And then on the marriage side, though, Paul's like, it's true. Even though I think in some ways Paul is like, I don't know why he emphasizes singleness as being such a wonderful thing. I mean, obviously he was single, Jesus was single. So I'm not saying it, but I'm just wondering what the questions were, what he was dealing with in Corinth. And maybe there was just so much, bizarre sexuality, even temple prostitution and all those things in Corinth, that he was saying, you guys all just need to take a break. Like everyone should just try singleness for a while, because it's too much of a mess there. I don't know why he was emphasizing that, but he does make sure and say, each one is a gift. To one, this is given. To one, this is given. And I don't know how far we can take that. Definitely single and married, but in Paul's mind, it could be that, if in one way, like if your spouse does pass away, you even have to look at that, not the spouse passing away, but your new station in life as, this is a new gift God has given you, so that you can find his grace in a new way. And even to the extent where if a divorce happens, in the sense that a spouse leaves, an unbelieving spouse or whatever, Paul's saying, don't look at that as a curse. Mm-hmm. Even though he's not saying the actual event, because that can be horrendous, what happens. But now that you're in this spot, you've got to get to a place where you can actually see, hey, God knows, and God can turn this into a gift where you get to experience his grace in a new way.
Yeah.
If you want to be married so bad and yet you're still single, hey, God knows all of that, but you got to see where you're at is a gift from the Lord.
Yeah.
It's a gift with a purpose attached to it. It's a gift where God knows. And in some ways, if you knew everything that God knew, you would actually be so glad you are where you are.
Yeah.
But it's really hard, especially in our culture and especially with our longings to get to that place. But if you're ever being discouraged as a single person, read 1 Corinthians 7 and you'll be like, what's up? I'm the greatest, you know?
And you can, open up a book and look at church history too, and read the many, 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 many stories, biographies and autobiographies of powerful men and women of God who've been
vows
faithful,
of celibacy,
and who've done so much of what they've done, not in spite of, but in part because of their decision to be faithful to the Lord only in that way. Yeah. It's a beautiful thing, and I think that's a pretty good place to wrap up. Obviously, there's a lot more to talk about on all of this, and so we'll be talking about marriage and some marriage-adjacent things for a while here. So plenty more podcasts. We've also got some stuff that some of you guys mentioned in there, some questions you had in that marriage survey we did a little bit ago.
Right.
We'll be pulling those out most likely in the coming
one thing,
weeks.
if you do want a deeper dive than this deep dive, a deep dive, whatever, I listened to David Guzik, Guzik, teach on 1 Corinthians 7, and I actually thought he did a really good job. And he really goes verse by verse through the whole thing. And there was a lot of times where I thought that is a really practical but profound point he was making. So you can check. It's just on YouTube or whatever. But David, Guzik, David Guzik on 1 Corinthians 7.
Yeah, and as we've been mentioning that, The Meaning of Marriage.
Yeah, so good.
By Tim Keller. Such a good one, which we have in our Courtyard to buy or also just on Amazon or wherever. But anyway, thank you guys so much for hanging with us. Thank you for listening as we deep dive into 1 Corinthians 7 and talk about marriage and singleness and all that the Lord has for us and all of those good gifts from the Lord. And we will see you on Sunday.